In the problem of Atlantis, I think there are a number of points that have not been generally considered. We think of Atlantis as an island, probably somewhere in the Atlantic, and probably about in the location of the present Azores Islands. But actually, Atlantis was a diffusion. If you buy a map now of the world as it is today, we can say that that is the modern distribution. But to have a map of Atlantis as it was in the time of its glory, you would have to have a map of the entire planet, because it was a distribution. Continents rose and fell, islands came up and went down, great land shifts occurred, and the Atlantic distribution of land was far more important and far more far-reaching than the mere problem of an island somewhere in the ocean. So we have to think of Atlantis in relationship to a complete pattern of the planet. As Plato clearly points out, the island of Poseidonis, which we now think of as Atlantis, was the last fragment of a great empire. It is the last surviving part, and is supposed to have disappeared under the ocean about 12,000 years before the Trojan War, which would make it about 15,000 years ago. Now, in connection with the problem of Atlantis, I think the next thing we have to study is the name. Plato refers to the mysterious empire as Atlantis. He probably received this name, or secured it, from Solon, who in turn had received it from the priests of the Egyptian temple at Sais. Now, the word Atlantis, or its root, is not Egyptian, and it is not Greek. No one seems to be able to trace the origin of the name. It appears on two very important phases of ancient mythology, Atlantis and Atlas. And the root is ATL, Atal. Now, if we look to find a language in which that word or that root is permissible or was used, we find you'd have to come to the Western Hemisphere, because Atal was one of the month names of the Mayas. It also has more than just a name significance. Its glyph, or its symbol, is a deluge. This seems then to give us the real basis of our word, that we are dealing with a term that represents a world experience, that various countries were involved in it, that the circumstances were known around the entire planet, and that the name that has survived to us today is probably based upon the records on the Western Hemisphere. Now, if we take the general term to represent this mysterious region, we then can find from the Codex Troano, which is in the museum in Madrid, one of the surviving documents of the Mayas, that this particular deluge is marked in the glyphs of the people. The story is told in pictures, but among these pictures there is one in which the sky dragon, or the sky serpent, is pouring water from its mouth, and below this the god of death is dancing on the earth. Now, this was a long time ago, long before the coming of the Spaniards, but the records even go much further than that. According to the Chinese, the previous existence before our present coming to this earth was destroyed. The previous world was destroyed by water, a tremendous deluge. And in the I Ching, the 8 trigrams, basic trigrams, correspond to Noah and his wife, their 3 sons and their 3 wives, were the 8 who were saved. And this is exactly what the Chinese tell us. So the story goes around here and there and everywhere. It's a very interesting story, but what does it really mean? Is it merely an archaeological curiosity, or does it have some dynamic value for us today? I would like to think of Atlantis much as Lord Bacon did in his book, The New Atlantis, in which he says in very simple terms, the New Atlantis, which is America. Bacon was quite convinced that on the Western Hemisphere a great empire would arise, an empire that would surpass the glory of the Atlantean story, and that this new world would not be destroyed. It would not turn against the gods. It would not misuse the energies of nature, and as a result would become a new world, a restoration of the Golden Age. Now, when we study this Atlantean problem a little more carefully, we realize there have been a number of speculations on this. Vice President Dawes made quite an extensive search for the Atlantean world. A number of good archaeologists and ethnologists have devoted time to it. And the general attitude is no longer to discard it as a fable, but to try to find out what its actual meaning could be. Now let us suppose that Solon was correct, and that Solon, being an old man, was unable to do what he had intended to do, and that was to write out an account of the lost Atlantis as he found it, or it was given to him, in the caves under the Temple of Sais in Egypt. Here on columns formed of orichalcum, a metal that cannot perish, was recorded the story of a lost world. These two tablets are sometimes referred to as the Tables of Enoch, and we find a great deal of mystical lore surrounding this story. In any event, Solon, being very old and unable to carry on the work, passed the legend on to one of his descendants who was a student of Plato's. And this student, in turn, told Plato, who took the story, to use it as a great symbolical account of the descent of man. Now, Plato does not deny that the story is literally true, but he does point out so many very subtle and unusual details that we are forced to realize that he embellished it to represent the entire story of the planet Earth and its development. According to Plato, at a remote time, the gods of high Olympus distributed the world to their various sub-deities, and to Poseidon was given the lands of the sea, the great oceans, the islands, the archipelagos. And Poseidon created his kingdom in the oceans, and he created a wonderful city called the City of the Golden Gate. And in this city there was the temple to him, and in this temple were the tablets containing the laws of life, the laws that must be obeyed if man is to survive and to enjoy the favors of the gods. And the Atlantic Empire consisted of 7 islands, and these 7 islands also occur in the Mexican story. These islands came together to form a league, and this league in turn created a kind of empire. And in the course of ages, the princes of the islands of the Atlantides became very proud. They decided that they would conquer the world. So in order to achieve this great end, they decided to send expeditions of conquest over all the other parts of the then Atlantean distribution. Now, this distribution at that time consisted, much as it does today, of countries of various degrees of development. It was not an uninhabited world. The Atlanteans were not the only people. But these other people were comparatively primitive. They were like the natives of Africa, or the natives of some Polynesian area, or perhaps the natives of some distant islands of the South Pacific. They were primitive people, but they existed. And the Atlantean merchants went to them, traded with them, and bartered with them. Plato states definitely that Atlantis had a great mercantile. that it traveled to all parts of the world, that it even visited Europe and as far south as South America. But gradually this empire grew more and more proud. Gradually fame, wealth, and power became the great objectives for life. And there was another dimension. These peoples possessed extrasensory perceptions that had not yet been closed by the process of embodiment. They were like the extrasensory perceptions of small children, in whom faculties are partly active, which are now dormant in our racial groups. So in any way, these magicians, these sorcerers, these powerful ones who possessed vril being the one motive power that is inexhaustible, something we could use today, that would carry anything, transport anything, activate anything that the human being could conceive. And so in their pride, these princes decided near the end of their time to invade what is now Europe. They decided to invade in the areas of the Mediterranean, North Africa, and the Near East. So they sent great fleets to conquer these countries. In the meantime, the deities, particularly Poseidon, realizing what was occurring, gave warnings and sent prophets and told these people they were destroying themselves, but they were proud and they gave no mind or no thought to consequence. And finally they rebelled against the gods, and the gods reacted accordingly. In a single night, the great center of Atlantean culture, the island of Poseidonis, the last surviving fragment of an ancient order of life, disappeared under the ocean, and according to the Maya calendar, carried with it to death 60 million human beings. This was the end of a great cycle of misuses and abuses in which those powers, forces, and principles which had been intended to be of common good to all mankind were perverted and in one way or another turned against the will of heaven, and in consequence they were destroyed. Now this also causes us to have another little interlude here, which I think we should give a thought to. We are told by Plato and several other historians of the time that various agencies, various merchants, travelers, explorers from Atlantis visited other lands. And among those who visited other lands were the priests of the Atlanteans, those who worshipped the great golden serpent. Serpent worship was one of the oldest religions of the world. Now these various missionaries, shall we say, went to primitive people, as we send missionaries today to underprivileged or gradually evolving groups. And these missionaries set up various institutions in the distant parts of the empire, the parts that were not actually destroyed by the destruction of the Atlantean centerland. Now, it seems to me, and I realize that this is hypothetical, but it seems to me that this explains a series of legends and myths which are of interest. We are told, for example, that the people of Chaldea and Babylonia were very primitive, that they had not yet discovered the use of fire, that they did not know how to cook food, they did not know how to keep records, they had no medical knowledge, they had no laws to live by and no governments except tribal communes. And in the midst of all this time, while they were living along the shores of the sea, one day something strange happened. A being came out of the sea. This being, whom they called Oannes, had the body of a fish and the head of a human being, and wore on his head the head of a fish on end. If you see the old pictures, you realize that his hat was what we call today a mitre, which is practically exactly the shape of a fish's head.